I think having to tell family and friends we'd had something come up was a really difficult process. That, our son had been diagnosed with a genetic condition, one no one had ever heard about, one which people didn't quite understand the severity of. I found that whole process quite difficult. So to be able to find your community and get that support and know that you're not alone and know that we have these beautiful kids who are running around and jumping and active and learning, and who, Hudson is so intelligent, he's reading, who are excelling. And then there are teenagers who are doing really well at school, and there are adults who, have their PhDs, and finding that community and taking that breath and being like, it will be okay, rather than doing what I probably did, which was lots of spirals at 5 o'clock in the morning when my husband used to go to work. Any PKU mum that I meet who's kind of new to our community, you're an instant friend.
Welcome to Breastfeeding with ABA, a podcast brought to you by volunteers from the Australian Breastfeeding Association. Breastfeeding with ABA is a podcast about breastfeeding, made by parents for parents. In this episode, we're hearing Yolanda's story of breastfeeding a baby with PKU. This podcast records in different parts of Australia. Acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're recording on and the lands you're listening on. We pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous people listening. We also acknowledge the long history of oral storytelling on this country and of women supporting each other to learn to feed their babies. My name is Simone and I'm a breastfeeding counsellor with the Australian Breastfeeding Association and an international board-certified lactation consultant.
My name's Jessica. I'm a breastfeeding counsellor with the Australian Breastfeeding Association. I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and my pronouns are she, her.
Yolanda Shannon is a commercial lawyer from Melbourne. She is the mother to 3-year-old Hudson, a very happy and busy boy who also happens to have a genetic condition called PKU. Hudson was diagnosed with PKU when he was 5 days old, and over the last 3 years, Yolanda has found a passion for educating others on this rare condition. She's here today to help spread awareness of PKU and to give back to the amazing ABA community that helped her so many times during her own breastfeeding journey.
So welcome, Yolanda. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your family?
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. So my name's Yolanda Shannon. I have my beautiful boy, Hudson, who's 3 years old, and my amazing husband, Mike, and we live here in Melbourne.
We'll also hear from Erin, a health professional working in the metabolic unit at the Royal Children's Hospital.
My name is Erin Mullane and I'm a paediatric dietitian. I've been working in newborn screening and metabolic disorders for the last 10 years or so, and in general paediatric nutrition with infants and small children for maybe 15 to 20 years. So I'm also a lactation consultant and a volunteer with the ABA.
Yolanda, tell us about your journey about having your first baby, Hudson.
So my husband and I got married just before COVID. We're very lucky in that sense. And as COVID hit and everyone was going into lockdowns, like many people, we started thinking of growing our family.
For about
had started trying for about 6 months when we were lucky enough to fall pregnant with Hudson, and it was quite a simple process. We were very lucky to have a relatively easy pregnancy, minus a little bit of pregnancy morning sickness, which went along for what felt like way too long. But no, we had a great pregnancy and a really wonderful natural birth, and Hudson was born on the 12th of June 2021.
So, Yolanda, I know you got a phone call when Hudson was 5 days old. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so look, we'd had a wonderful kind of newborn bubble period when Hudson was born. We were lucky enough to, like I said, have a pretty normal, natural, uncomplicated birth. We'd spent a few days at the hospital and feeding was going well. We were just so in love with our little boy, and we took him home, I think, on day 4. And just as we had taken him home, I think the effects of the sleep deprivation and the baby blues were starting to creep in. So after a rather sleepless night for myself, my husband had sent me off in the afternoon for a little bit of an afternoon nap. So while I was sleeping, my phone was just on the coffee table and it rang, and my husband obviously just ignored it. It was a number he didn't know. And then it called again straight away, and Mike realised that, he should pick this up, might be something important. And there was a wonderful nurse from the metabolic team at the Children's Hospital who introduced herself and asked if I was available for a chat. And he said, look, she's had, a really sleepless night. She really needs some rest. Can we call you back once she's up and awake? And she went, no, you really need to go and wake her up. And I think that's when my husband realised that something serious had come up. He came and woke me up, and I remember walking down the hallway of our house, feeling a little bit groggy and a little bit unsure as to why we'd had a call from the Children's Hospital. And we sat on the couch and she gave us the news that Hudson's genetic carrier screening, his newborn screening test had come up with a genetic condition. So it gives me goosebumps. I remember sitting on that couch and just feeling like everything froze and then started crashing down around us. And just as a new parent, to get a call like that completely out of the blue, it was really hard to process. Obviously, the staff from the Children's Hospital we were chatting to were amazing. She explained to us that his heel prick test had come positive with quite likely to be a genetic condition. We would have to go to the hospital the next day to confirm those results. She made it clear that they were going to send us a whole pack of information and not to Google this condition. When she said the condition was called phenylketonuria or PKU, it was something my husband and I had never heard of. We had no family history that we knew of. I didn't even know this word existed. Didn't know this condition
We have trouble
existed.
saying it too, don't we?
Yeah, we do. It took me about, Hudson's first year to actually perfect how to say it, but it was incredibly difficult to process all of this information out of the blue, coming off, 5 days of having just become parents and dealing with that newborn sleep deprivation. And it was incredibly difficult moment in time. So when we finally ended that phone call, and I guess we went a little bit into action mode, I guess. We had to start preparing for the next day, which was this, visit to the Children's Hospital, and we just brought our baby home. We weren't planning on going anywhere for at least a good week or so. The idea of kind of heading out the house for a walk seemed overwhelming, let alone having to get into the car at 7 o'clock the next day and drive to the children. So we just started reaching out to our community and talking to friends who already had kids to be like, how do I pack a hospital bag? What do I have to bring in my nappy bag if we're going to be at the Children's for who knows how long? We started reaching out to any friend we knew who had a background in medicine to see if anybody had ever heard of phenylketonuria. And when you're chatting to friends who are nurses and GPs and they don't even know what this condition is, it was really, really scary. And then we did a bit of Googling, even though we got told not to.
Just how did that work out for you?
Not great. One of the first things you see when you look up phenylketonuria is obviously it's about diet and it's about protein. And then you see the words brain damage. So if it's unmanaged, it can cause irreversible brain damage and intellectual disability. So having that pop up on your Google page on your phone was quite overwhelming. But I think to a large degree, we still went to bed that night not knowing the severity of it. I remember being in bed with Mike and us chatting through what it could mean. And one thing we'd been told was it might be a false positive. So that was just, not by the Children's Hospital, but a friend had been, I guess, trying to find those silver linings and those positive angles, had said, you might go in there, it might be nothing. They might just be being overly cautious. So we had that kind of hope still sitting with us when we went to bed that night. And then we also had this idea of if it's food related, we can manage it. We live in Melbourne. If our son's vegan or if he, has to be vegetarian or, that's so easy to do here. It'll be simple to manage, I guess, is what we had in our head when we kind of closed our eyes for the night. And we woke up the next morning and got into the car and it was pouring down with rain. And I just remember crying the whole way into the hospital and crying the whole time we were there and the whole way home. So it was a lot to process. Yeah.
So let's hear from our health professional expert, Erin, for a more technical definition.
Well, metabolic disorder generally is, well, certainly the dietary metabolic disorders are usually caused by a deficiency in some kind of enzyme. Quite often in the patients that I see, it's an enzyme that's produced by cells in the liver, and it's caused by a genetic defect in the genes that kind of make that enzyme. There are lots of different types of metabolic disorders, obviously, and the ones that predominantly are managed by diet are usually protein disorders such as PKU. So there's usually an enzyme that's responsible for some kind of either metabolism or conversion of a particular amino acid into a different amino acid or another compound that is faulty. And so it really can create a whole lot of nutritional and other problems if it's not treated.
And Erin, how do people usually find out that they have a metabolic disorder?
Lots of the metabolic disorders currently are screened for in Australia on newborn screening. So the heel prick test that babies will have somewhere around the second day of life screens for a lot of these conditions. And so that screening test is sent to our screening lab in Victoria. All the cards are sent to our screening lab, who will run a whole lot of tests on that for various amino acids and other metabolites usually. And then the metabolic team will receive a flag that there's been an abnormal result, and it's followed up from there.
And how common is it for one of these disorders to show up on that screening?
So metabolic disorders as a whole in our unit, there may be somewhere around 100 to 150 of those a year. For PKU specifically and the amino acid disorders that are managed by diet, we tend to get somewhere between about 5 and 15 in a year, positive diagnosis for those. I think the average is around 7 or 8. So we're looking at, kind of 0 to 1 each month that we receive. Metabolic disorders as a whole, the number is somewhere around 1 in 5,000 births or something like that. But PKU is more rare than that, at around 1 in 10,000. And then some of the other amino acid disorders are even more rare than that. So it is very small numbers, but it's a big part of our work in this unit. The PKU is a deficiency of an enzyme called phenylalanine hydroxylase, which is an enzyme that's produced in the liver, and it's responsible for converting the amino acid phenylalanine to the amino acid tyrosine. And that is a result of a genetic defect. So what happens in those patients is that when they take in protein from food or breast milk, in the case of an infant, they can metabolize most of the amino acids, but not the phenylalanine. So they will have a buildup of that phenylalanine in their bloodstream, and phenylalanine can be a neurotoxic amino acid at high levels. They also, as a result of not being able to convert that to tyrosine, will have a deficiency of the amino acid tyrosine. So they had some, if it's untreated, have some neurological effects, but also some signs of essentially protein deficiency, such as, poor growth and skin problems and hair falling out and that kind of thing. Although that's certainly not what we would see anymore because of screening. But in the early days, they were the sort of symptoms that could appear.
And what did they tell you in that meeting, I guess, about breastfeeding?
Yeah, so I was lucky in the sense that my husband's stepmom over in New Zealand was, or still is, a nurse, and she had done a bit of research for me. She knew how much I wanted to breastfeed Hudson, how important it was for me, and how I'd been putting things in place with you, Simone, kind of in the lead up to Hudson arriving into our world so that we could have a successful breastfeeding journey. So she gave me the warning that they might ask me to stop breastfeeding for 24 hours, which I'm so glad that she had done that research and was able to kind of pre-warn us of that, because breastfeeding had been something which I was so determined to do and had just put in 5 days with all my effort trying to establish that breastfeeding relationship with Hudson. So I went in there knowing that they might have some instructions as to me breastfeeding Hudson. So when we went into that room and were confronted with 5 specialists, all kind of with their own different expertise, but all there to help educate us about PKU. One of the big things was to kind of test and see what Hudson's protein levels were already doing and how high they were. And yeah, the first instructions were, as soon as you get home from this appointment, you'll have to stop breastfeeding. Based on his levels, you'll have to stop breastfeeding for at least 24 hours. And if you want to continue breastfeeding, you'll have to pump So if you don't have a pump, you have to go home and buy a pump. On your way home, you have to buy bottles. Here's a sheet on how to mix formula. And we were so lucky in the sense that I had always wanted to establish breastfeeding, but eventually get to the stage where I could express and my husband could give a bottle. And being the over-prepared person that I was, all the bottles were already sterilised at home. The steriliser was set up, even though we weren't planning on using them for a good couple of months. I could not imagine how difficult it would have been for us to have spent a very long day at the Children's and just whip past Baby Bunting on the way home and have to buy a breast pump or have to buy some bottles. Like, we were exhausted, and it was one thing that I was grateful for, that we could just go home and we already had that there. I can imagine that would have been very difficult for a lot of other PKU parents who got that diagnosis and then had to still make a visit to the shops after a very emotional and tiring day. And I guess from a breastfeeding perspective, I was breastfeeding the whole day we were at the hospital, the same time as being told that the protein in my breast milk was potentially damaging to my son's brain. So that's a really odd, and I've now kind of recognised probably traumatic thing to have experienced. And when we got home and out of the car, and, the hospital's a good 40 minutes away from our home, Hudson was screaming, hungry, wanted to be fed. And it felt so overwhelming to think about preparing a bottle in that moment. We hadn't ever thought of doing formula, and not that's a difficult thing to do, but in that moment, reading those instructions and putting together a formula bottle just felt like it was going to be so overwhelming. And I remember calling the dietitian in tears saying, he's hungry, we've just gotten home, can I feed him myself one more time and then start the 24-hour period of not feeding him? And I remember saying to her, am I going to be damaging him if I feed him this time? And the dietitian very kindly reassured me that it was okay to feed him and make him comfortable. And that gave us a couple of hours then to read instructions and look at how we had to prepare a formula bottle. So, yeah, it was a lot to come to terms with in 24 hours.
That does sound like a lot. And I can see that it's still very emotional for you as well. Do you feel comfortable telling us how you were feeling when that was happening?
Yeah, of course. I think part of it is just survival mode. In saying that, obviously, physically I was processing it by being quite upset. There was a lot of tears. I do remember that phone call back to the hospital and really feeling that guilt of having to ask her, will I be damaging him if I feed him this one time? Should we let him cry so that we can get a bottle sorted? Yeah, it was really conflicting, this need to just want to feed him, and that had felt, wasn't natural yet, but it was starting to feel like our breastfeeding journey was working. So to have to stop that and stop that for 24 hours, yeah, just very emotional. I think I've only kind of realised, the last couple of years just how traumatic it was. Yeah. Just that conflicting view of, am I damaging my son by actually responding to his need? But at the time, I just remember just crying and just being a bit in shock still. And by that stage, we'd gone to bed the night before thinking this might be nothing, or it might be something which isn't that serious. And I think we'd had that bubble popped at the hospital. So, yeah, it was difficult.
Let's hear from Erin again. Erin, in your experience, how do parents feel about that change to breastfeeding that they need to make when they come in for that first appointment?
Sometimes the breastfeeding is not something that is in the front of the parents' minds, or at least it appears that way, because they're being given information that their baby has a disorder that could cause damage to their brain. And so, and in the background, they've gone home and they've Googled that and found out, the worst case scenario stories on the internet. So they're essentially grieving for the child that they thought they would have to now this child that, is perfectly well and healthy and can certainly lead a very normal, healthy life. But all of those what ifs that come with that. So are they going to be affected by this?
Has their brain been damaged? Are they going to be able to do things that other kids do? So there's a lot of grief around it, I would say.
And Erin, as a health professional, how do you support families who want to continue breastfeeding after getting a diagnosis of a metabolic disorder?
Yeah, so we do give them some information in the very beginning about expressing and storing breast milk. Also talking to them about the expectation of what a breastfeeding relationship will look like, because in a child with PKU, they will be monitoring blood levels for phenylalanine very regularly, once or twice a week for the first few months. And if those levels are high, that means that we need to either stop or reduce the breastfeeding for a time. And if those levels are low, it means that we need to increase the breastfeeding for a time. So while it's not possible for these families to exclusively breastfeed, because they do need some supplementary formula that does not contain phenylalanine in order to balance their levels, it is possible for them to continue breastfeeding as long as they want to. And so really asking questions about the breastfeeding and the feeding in general is part of the kind of routine assessment every time we see them. And we would see these families face-to-face once every couple of weeks, but we're speaking to them on the phone, sometimes daily, but often at least twice a week for the first couple of months that we're speaking to them a lot. And so asking them about feeding and any trouble that they're having is a routine part of that.
I know that there was certain instructions you had to follow with the formula, and once that 24 hours was over, you had to sort of combine formula and breastfeeding. How did that sort of work over the next month or so?
Yeah. It was really complicated. I guess the one thing to really note is that the Children's Hospital was so supportive of me breastfeeding, which was a relief, because I think if they weren't, it would have been really difficult. You know, you want to do what's best for your child. And if they had told me that stopping breastfeeding and formula feeding so that you could have a more accurate understanding of how much protein he's getting in, that would have been what I did. But I was so grateful for them saying you can continue to breastfeed. What it meant was, obviously, we had a 24-hour period of purely formula, and this formula is not baby formula you just go get from the supermarket. It's a specific formula designed for children with this condition, in the sense that it has everything they need other than this one building block of protein, which is known as phenylalanine, and that's the building block which damages Hudson's brain. So pumping for that first 24 hours was really difficult. I remember feeling all the lumps in my breast. I was lucky it was only for a 24-hour period and managed to avoid mastitis or anything too serious. And after that, the instructions were we were to make up a formula bottle with a set amount of formula, and that amount was dictated by the Children's Hospital based on how much they figured Hudson was eating at the time based on his age, his weight. So we'd feed Hudson that formula bottle first to fill up his little tummy, and then I could breastfeed to appetite afterwards. So that sounds fine in theory, except when you have a child who doesn't necessarily sleep and wake up at certain hours. And I remember Hudson used to, I guess like any kid, used to feel like he used to snack and cluster feed, and it was sometimes difficult to work out. It was fine if he'd had a sleep, get up, you do the routine of making him a formula bottle, and then I could breastfeed him afterwards. But if he'd had a short nap and trying to calculate how long it had been since his last bottle, whether I could just put him on the boob quickly to put him back to sleep, if he then started feeding more, whether I had to take him off my breast so I could go get him a bottle. Yeah, it sounded a lot easier when they told us than what it was putting it into practice. But the idea was that we had to fill up his tummy with this formula, which didn't contain this one aspect of protein, and then I could breastfeed him as normal. On the basis it was still important that he did get some natural protein, which is what he was getting from my breast milk.
And what was the process like in terms of making sure that he was getting the right amount of protein?
There's no real way to find out what his protein levels are doing. We've always kind of compared it to diabetes, where you can do a little prick and find out almost instantly. Because PKU is so rare, there's just not that technology yet. The process for finding out what his protein levels are doing involves us taking at that time, a heel prick test, sending it to the newborn screening labs, and waiting 5 days to get his blood test results. So we had a plan from the Children's Hospital, which was he needs this much formula over a 24-hour period, which means that given his age, you're probably feeding him this much. But we wouldn't really know until we got those blood tests back what he was doing, how hungry he was, how much breast milk he was getting. So it was a good plan, and it was always done by the Children's Hospital to, I guess, mitigate his levels ever getting dangerously high. But you would still have times where, as a mum, I'd be breastfeeding him and questioning if he was hungrier, if he was getting more than what we had anticipated, what the Children's Hospital were kind of estimating. So it was a process and would result in doing that blood test, waiting 5 days anxiously, getting that little app message saying what his levels were, and then either feeling a sense of relief that they were, his protein levels were in the acceptable range, he was getting enough of what he needed, not too much, not too little, or having that phone call from the children saying his levels are too high, you need to increase formula so that he's in turn getting less of your breast milk, and then the guilt which would follow from that, and the sadness. And I think every time we got that call saying you need to increase his formula by 5 mils or 2 mils or 10 mils, I would feel like I was grieving a little bit because I felt like he wasn't getting as much as my breast milk as I would want. And yeah, it was a bit of a process for me every week.
I remember that happening. Yeah, I remember that happening. And I remember you coming back to me saying, we have to go to 20 now, we have to go to 30 mils now, we have to go. And I think I still remember it being 50 mils for some reason at some point. And then he had to breastfeed after. But I remember in my mind thinking, he was a really good little feeder, this baby. Like, he was a robust baby. He was feeding really, really well, and he probably had a pretty big appetite, I think. And I just remember thinking, if this was a little tiny jaundiced baby that was 2.5 kilos, the 50 mils would have filled them to the top. Whereas with him, he'd probably just keep going for seconds and thirds afterwards, and he was sort of helping your supply along with that.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, phew, I'm glad this baby's a good feeder. Because when we worked out, when we worked out that he had to have 50 mils before every feed, and we worked out a little bit of an expressing routine to keep your supply up in the meantime, then I was like, whew, I'm glad that's going to work.
And it just goes to show how much you doubt yourself as a new mum as well, because I remember coming into your office and just feeling awful and upset and like I wasn't doing a good job, and so worried because we were giving him this bottle whether he was actually feeding well. And I would go in and see Simone and she'd be like, he's feeding great. He's really feeding well, and you just think, oh, that relief. But I'd always walk into your room feeling, doubting myself and feeling stressed, and always walk out feeling like, okay, no, we've got this. We're doing okay. We can keep this journey going, because that constant pressure, I think, to just stop the breastfeeding and pop him on a formula bottle was always kind of there from people. My husband was very supportive of me breastfeeding, and my parents and family were very supportive, but you still kind of got the feeling from people that they thought it would be much easier if we just said no to this journey.
Yeah.
But it's not what I wanted, and we got to 2.5 years breastfeeding with Hudson, so we stuck it out.
I do remember also as a lactation consultant thinking I'd never heard of this either, and, doing lots of little reading and researching. And I guess mainly what we sort of connected on is just, I guess I had to use my breastfeeding knowledge in knowing how supply and demand works. And if we're working with mums who are mixed feeding in any way, we have to work out ways to protect the supply and to keep the baby on the breast, and ways to keep that happening. It's not always going to be, let's give them this amount of formula and this amount of breast, because babies aren't robots, and they're actually going to go, oh, actually this bottle's easier. I'm going to start wanting that instead of the breast. So we had to think of lots of ways to keep him motivated to keep breastfeeding as well.
And that kind of knowledge, I guess, is so beneficial. And then having to apply it to a situation which is probably flipped to what you're used to when babies are needing a top-up feed and that bottle comes secondary, whereas the instructions we'd had from the Children's Hospital where we needed to give him that bottle first. And I remember that being something which you and I really worked through, and it was a huge concern. Even just little things like learning what bottles are better in those circumstances, learning what teats are better to try and prevent him from getting that bottle preference, which obviously in the end he did end up getting, but to be able to kind of hold on to that breastfeeding as long as possible and to be able to then work through those bottle preferences. So I do hear people kind of in different countries, obviously everyone has a different way of doing it. I think I've heard of people who would breastfeed to begin with to a timer and then have to go to a bottle. At the end of the day, very grateful for the journey that we had. Obviously, still very complicated and still very difficult, but I think giving him that bottle first and then being able to put him on my breast afterwards and have that time and not feeling like I then had to pull him off. We still got to have a lot of those benefits of those cuddling and the connection, the relationship, and breastfeeding him to sleep and all those things that I wanted to do. So while it was always quite stressful going to that bottle first, it was still a great way to do it.
And then you can make the breast a nice place to be, which also helps the baby to want to be there for a longer amount of time and, you know, in terms of months and years or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. It was probably part of the reason we could do it so long, because it was a form of comfort for Hudson.
And I know that that's one of the things that I always go to first when I speak to people if they're having difficulties with breast refusal is first step is to make the breast a happy place. It's not something that we want to put the baby on there when they're screaming and starving. It's like, no, we want to have a nice relaxing time, have a cuddle with no pressure to get back to the breast. It's just we want baby to be happy there, and once they're happy at the breast, they'll kind of relax into it a little bit and find their way back to it a lot of times.
Yes. Yeah.
So you said that you were kind of combining the bottle feeding first and then comfort feeding afterwards. So did that bring up any challenges for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was probably easier at the start when Hudson was having decent sleeps. The moment that he started catnapping, waking up early, I guess being a very anxious first-time mum, was always quick to respond to him and to want to calm him down. And the way I was doing that was putting him on my breast. So there would be times I'd pop into his room to put him back to sleep and would be in there for much longer than what I was expecting. And that's when the panic, especially once my husband went to work and I was home by myself and I didn't have someone to talk to about it, the panic that I was giving him too much breast milk and that I was potentially damaging his brain, basically. I remember so many times sitting on our rocking chair just thinking, have we been here for too long? Have I, should I be taking him off and getting a bottle? And that stress. Obviously, when he wakes up in the middle of the night, having to go and get the bottle rather than just being able to put him on my breast, I found quite difficult. I was lucky that Mike, my husband, was always up and one of us was always able to hold Hudson while the other person went and put the bottle together. But I would find it really challenging not just being able to pop him onto my breast when I knew that's what he wanted. So, yeah, so many challenges in that first month. And then obviously, as he got a little bit older, that breast refusal started to come into play and that bottle preference. And I think, we obviously were able to go see Simone and chat through some options and make some changes to what bottles we were using, and that helped. But yeah, I took that really to heart when he started not wanting to breastfeed. And then the supply issues, I do feel like he was feeding well when we were breastfeeding, but pumping used to absolutely destroy my confidence trying to see how much milk would come out when I was pumping and see it be less and less and less every time. So there was so many times where I would try and breastfeed and get worried that, he wasn't feeding, and then try and pump and be worried that he wasn't full, and a lot of questioning myself, a lot of doubt, a lot of guilt. Yeah, it's crazy to think back to now, actually, because I do feel like we got some redemption with our breastfeeding journey, and I do look at it as being a successful journey. But yeah, I struggled quite a lot mentally with that whole process of juggling the bottle and the breast.
And I think it was around the 4 months, wasn't it, Mark,
yes.
when he did the refusal type thing. And I remember when you did come and see me around that time, and maybe he was even getting close to 5 months at that stage, that you mentioned that there was a chance of starting solids a little bit earlier, and that the solids would mean that he wouldn't have to have the special solids that he needed, and you'll probably be able to explain that, would mean that he didn't have to have as much of the formula.
Yes.
So I was thinking, great, let's get on to that.
Simone was very good at being like, we've just got to hold out till he starts solids, and then and then things will ease up and get easier. So around the time Hudson started solids, which was about 5 months, we introduced a new type of supplement. So this formula he was having served as a baby formula. They're synthetically made, and they basically serve to give him everything he wasn't getting by not being able to just have breast milk. So similar thing once you move to solids, there's so many different food groups that children with this condition can't go near. So we're not just talking about protein in meat or dairy. Some vegetables are too high in protein. Like the protein level that Hudson could have was 5 or 6 grams a day is what we kind of worked out his allowance was. If you think about that, it's 1 egg has about 6 grams of protein. And you say that to people and they're like, oh yeah, so you could give him an egg, but you can't. You have to measure how much protein is in a banana, how much protein is in broccoli, peas, corn, all of those foods. Just your plain vegetables have protein in them, let alone when you start thinking about dairy, too high, nuts, too high, legumes too high, most grains, even normal flour, too high in protein. So the supplement which Hudson is getting is not just filling him up, but it's also giving him all the nutrients from all these different food groups which he can't have. So once you get to the stage of having solids, it switches from a bottle, a formula, to almost like a gel consistency. And because it's amino acid base, it's quite potent in flavour. I've tried to take it before myself and have not been successful in finishing it, but Hudson's been on it since he was 5 months old. And I remember we had to slowly give him like a little teaspoon each of this gel formula to get him used to the flavour, and then he would have that with every meal. So at one stage when he started formula, we were still doing bottles. We were doing food. Once he had gotten used to eating, we were doing weighed food, so weighing out certain foods which had protein, as well as doing the supplement, as well as still breastfeeding. Like it was a lot to juggle.
I remember you telling me that you carry around this little scale, and you're thinking all these people looking at you going, oh my God, she's put her kid on a diet.
All the time. Every time I go and weigh chips in a cafe, so potatoes, they have protein. I know exactly how many chips Hudson can have to equal 1 gram of protein. And yeah, you either think that they must think I'm on a diet, or then when they give them to my son, I don't know what they're thinking, that he's on a diet. But yeah, I hope that there's a lot more awareness for different diet conditions out there that people don't judge. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to be doing out in public sometimes. Still not something I'm quite used to. But yeah, it was a lot to juggle. And that gel supplement at least, is like a kind of yogurty consistency. So it did mean that we could start slowly easing off the bottles. Like any baby, I guess you're still kind of doing a mixture of whether it's bottle or breastfeeding and foods up until over 12 months. So I don't think we weaned Hudson completely off the bottles till after he was 12 months old. But at least we were doing it less. And I don't remember being as stressed by the time that we hit that 12-month mark about the fact that he was getting bottles and breast milk. It kind of got into a bit of a rhythm.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about food.
Yes.
So it's something that, it's important to everyone really, and it's really culturally important for a lot of people. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and Hudson's dad, your partner's background, and what food meant to you and your families?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Italian and Greek, so food's a huge part of my growing up. Like I remember my parents throwing the most amazing birthday parties and Christmas parties and, elaborate cakes and always just lots of food. And I had probably had a more difficult relationship with food. So I had an eating disorder during my uni years where I had cut out large food groups for about 6 years. And then by the time I fell pregnant with Hudson, food was such a big part of my personality in the opposite way. I was really embracing my kind of culture of wanting to host and wanting to feed people. If you ask any of my friends, I'd say you come over to my house and you leave full. And it was part of my personality, this want to make delicious, amazing food for my friends and my family. And I think something which was just so tied to my image of how I would be as a mother. And I think probably more so than a lot of other people. I think having an Italian mother, an Italian grandmother, you really associate food and feeding with your role as a mum. I think having had the mental health issues of going through an eating disorder as well, I really had this view that as a mum, I would do everything I could to make sure that my kids didn't go through something similar and to make sure that we had a wide variety of food in our house. It was something I was probably thought of more than most people, I would have said, and had quite a lot of emotions around. My husband, coming from New Zealand, they obviously have their own traditions and foods. And yeah, I don't think Mike would have thought about it as much as I did, but yeah, we definitely both were people who loved to eat and to go out and to eat nice foods and to really put the focus on foods when we had friends over and had celebrations. So when Hudson was diagnosed, and some of the advice you get given is you learn how to make your life and your celebrations not around food. That was something which was really hard for me to process and I guess to accept. And then the guilt, I guess, of having gone through what I went through with my own mental health issues to then having a child who I do have to restrict all the food he eats and I do have to weigh out food. triggering for me, and also then a lot of guilt associated with having to do that for him. So lots of complicated feelings, probably, probably more so than some other people, just given such a complicated relationship I have with food myself.
So, Erin, can you tell us a bit about starting solids for babies who have PKU from your perspective?
There is quite a wide spectrum of PKU and how much children are affected. So some people do need a very strict diet, and for some it's more relaxed. But for a child with classical PKU, you'll be looking at quite a low protein diet. For those children, the bulk of their diet is fruits and vegetables, and they are able to eat very limited cereals and grains because of the protein content of those, and they avoid any higher protein foods from animal foods, so any meat, any dairy, any eggs, and even higher protein plant sources like nuts and tofu. They have to avoid those as well. So there are some specialised products that families can use that are kind of a protein modified rice, for example, that are made from various starches that families can use. But bulk of the diet is essentially fruits and vegetables, and then some breast milk if that's what they're having, and some PKU formula. And if they're not breastfeeding, then we would sometimes use some standard infant formula or just the PKU formula, the specialised medical food. Really, the makeup of the diet is similar, lifelong. So because you eat protein and phenylalanine really relative to your body size, sometimes that means when you're a bigger person, you can eat a little bit more protein than when you're a smaller person. But it also is impacted by growth. You know, the infants grow very fast, so sometimes they can manage more than an older child. But for a patient with classical PKU, we're looking at somewhere between 4 and 10 grams of protein in a 24-hour period. And really that looks like, a slice of bread, for example, has 3 grams of protein. A breast milk feed, might contain 1 to 2 grams of protein. So it's really quite restricted. So even adolescents and adults that have really classical PKU, the bulk of their diet really is still just fruit and vegetables, and then specialised kind of medical foods and formula.
Now, Hudson's diet probably changed, I guess, as he became a toddler and all those sorts of things. So how did it change for you with having to prepare foods for him?
Yeah. So when we started our PKU journey with food, we had basically a traffic light system from the Children's Hospital. We had a list of green foods. He could have as much as he likes. We had a list of orange food, which we have to weigh, and a list of red foods, which he can't have. So obviously those red foods are what I discussed earlier, the meats, seeds, nuts, legumes, quite an extensive list of foods we couldn't go anywhere near. Those green foods are a lot of vegetables and fruit. So most fruit and probably about half the vegetables you can think of are on a list which Hudson could eat as much as he liked. And those are the foods we started our solids journey with. So then as he got older and we were able to show that we were maintaining his protein levels in a safe range, we got to start introducing some of those orange foods, so like banana, sweet potato, avocado, like just really basic things. But it was a big deal for us to be able to give him those because they contained a level of protein. So began our journey of learning about protein in food and weighing food. So learning how to prepare a meal for Hudson where we actually knew how much protein was in that meal. The process requires you to pretty much weigh anything which you put into a meal which has protein in it, weigh the meal so that we know how much he's got in front of him, and then weigh how much he eats. Like he's a toddler. He's not going to eat the whole thing. Half of it's going to go on the floor. That was a bit of a complicated stage when he was really, you want your kids to enjoy food and you don't want to make it stressful. But man, every time I saw some food go on the floor and I was like, I actually have to make sure I scoop that up and weigh how much he's eating so we can get an accurate representation. When you're only dealing with about 6 grams a day, you have to be as accurate as you possibly can. So that journey, I guess, of having to, as he got older, manage which foods we were introducing, it was a lot simpler when he started and we could just give him single foods. But for us having to learn how to make a meal for him, calculating certain ingredients was a bit more difficult. So I do feel like our solids journey was tricky, but he did love food, which was helpful. You know, I've got these gorgeous photos of him, you know, with carrot all over his face or, you know, with a mango pip in his hands. And I think up until when we went through the difficult toddler journey of him starting to get a bit pickier, it was not too bad. It was always tricky going to family events and lunches and always having to bring our own food and just generally seeing the amount of food he couldn't eat. I really struggled with that. But we got into a groove, and my husband and I used to have little challenges as to who could get the perfect amount of banana, which equaled like 1 gram of protein on the first go. So yeah, we used to learn every day about different foods and just had to get on top of it.
And I think wasn't there a certain flour or something that you could purchase that contained the right amount and you could make things out of that?
Yeah. So learning how to cook for PKU is notoriously difficult. Flours are quite high in protein, which,
I didn't know that.
Like 25, about 10 grams of protein for about 100 grams of flour. So we have lucky enough to have companies which create special flours, create special pastas, rice alternatives. It's not rice, but it looks like rice. It acts like rice. All of these things are quite not nutritious.
Like processed.
Quite processed. They're not really nutrient dense. If you kind of think of like your gluten-free pastas and flours, it's like that, but to a kind of more extreme degree. But it was great to be able to have these options. You know, we're so lucky to have them available to us, and so began the journey of trying to work out how low protein flour cooks, because it's quite different and you have so many failed attempts of trying to cook something and it just completely failing and flopping, and lots of frustrated things going in the bin because you get a bit overstimulated and upset. And also just learning how things taste different as well, and having to kind of let go of, you know, what your view of something should taste like, I guess. Little things like chocolate is high in protein. And I remember around the time of Hudson's first birthday, there was a PKU-specific chocolate cake mix, right? So it's the flour, you just kind of add some orange juice to it. And it was a nice enough cake. It didn't taste anything like chocolate though, because it's not. You know, it's trying to mimic, they might put like a small amount of cocoa in it. But I remember kind of sitting there with my family and everyone telling me how nice of a cake it was, and just inside I was like, yeah, but it's not a chocolate cake, you know, like just those little things of having to readjust the way that you're used to cooking.
And how about as Hudson's been getting older and maybe wanting to choose what he eats himself and things like that? I mean, I guess he's going to have a lifetime of being educated on what he actually can say yes and no to, and I guess he's probably going to get to that stage soon where he's going to have to be more independent from you. And
having to, I think, as parents, expose him to that. Like it's important that he does see that he can't eat certain foods and that we can build that resilience in him of it's okay. You know, I think a lot of me was about wanting to hide that from him a lot of the time and wanting to not eat things in front of him that he couldn't eat. And you kind of get to the stage of realising, because he is an only child and he doesn't have older siblings, that if mum and dad aren't eating these things in front of him, then he's going to go out into the world, childcare, kinder, and not understand why he can't eat other foods that other kids are eating. So he has always been a very busy boy. So we've been lucky in the sense that when we go to a party, food is not necessarily the first thing on his radar. He's usually more keen to play than anything else. But yeah, we have just always tried to talk to him about PKU and to talk to him about protein and to talk to him about weighing his food. And even little things, like if my husband goes to the gym and has a protein supplement, like it's the complete opposite to what he's having in the sense of, you know, it's very, very high in protein, but it's still a supplement. So trying to kind of get the idea for him that, you know, it's okay for him to be having his supplements. We all do that kind of, you know, supplementation usually in our diet in one way or the other. So really trying to just talk about it in normal conversation with him that, you know, this has got too much protein. This is healthy for Hudson. You know, this will be healthy for your brain. I was very lucky enough we have an amazing PKU community, and there's a mum over in the UK with a 14-year-old daughter who has PKU, and she sent me all the way from the UK these beautiful range of books, which one of the PKU supplement companies over there had developed. And it's like this little set, about 20 little, square books. And they all talk about different elements of PKU, like going to a party and bringing your own food and bringing your own supplement. And yeah, I remember being able to read those to Hudson to kind of help enforce what Mike and I are just trying to chat about in day-to-day life. But it is funny when you realise how much he's taking on. Like, we've always gone out and had a burger at our local burger place, and Hudson always just gets the chips. And I remember we were doing a alphabet puzzle we'd been gifted, and H was for hamburger. And Hudson came out with, Mum and Dad eat hamburgers. Hudson just eats chips. And I'm like, oh, yeah, buddy, that's true. And having to then explain why Hudson doesn't eat a hamburger as well, and trying to explain that, we can make a hamburger at home, which he can eat, and make something if he wants to have that experience. But yeah, he's absorbing it all. We're just trying to make it as normal and natural as we can when we talk about that, and still expose him to it.
Can you tell me a little bit about what that process is like? Say you're planning on going out to a restaurant or out to a birthday party. I know that you mentioned earlier you've got your little scale set in your handbag. I imagine you take it with you everywhere. What's that like?
Yeah, it's complicated. I remember we've done a couple of trips with Hudson. So just the idea of traveling was so overwhelming. I remember having that moment when Hudson was a baby of being like, will he ever be able to go to Italy and eat a pizza? Like, will we be able to travel with him? How will this impact our lives? And usually it requires, anytime we go out, us reviewing the menu. My confidence with speaking with restaurants and chefs has definitely increased. I remember early on being at a restaurant and they had coconut yogurt on the menu in like a muesli thing. And I said, we'll pay for the whole lot. Can you just give me the coconut yogurt? Can you pop it on your scales in the kitchen? When you pour it, can you weigh 50 grams of coconut yogurt? And I remember them being like, this is difficult. We're busy. I'm like, you don't have to do anything else other than put it on the scales when you do it. But you do get resistance from cafes and restaurants who think that it's a big request, or I guess get worried that they're going to do the wrong thing. I've definitely gotten better at contacting restaurants before we go anywhere and kind of really explaining to them that we've seen your menu, we know that you use these vegetables here, here and here. Can you just literally just roast those up so that my son can have something other than just chips? Because the guilt of, I'm sure all toddlers and kids, I'm sure they all get chips a lot, but in particular, PKU kids live off chips when you're out. And when you do travel, you have to be willing.
Have chips.
There's plenty of places which don't, or even, so like gluten-free bread's not too bad. It's still, you can have some gluten-free breads which are high in protein. You can have some ones which are lower in protein. So if you go to a cafe and they don't have chips, gluten-free bread with avo is sometimes an option. But then having the conversation of, can you go out the back? Can you get the bread packet? Can you take a photo, or can you bring it to me so I can review it? And sometimes people are so accommodating, and other times you're met with resistance. So I think you just learn to navigate people's resistance when perhaps they are a little bit more unwilling to go out of their way to help you. And I think educating people and being kind and understanding can go a long way. And I've always thought that it's such a little thing, but if I can have a conversation with somebody at a restaurant and somebody else comes in with PKU or with another difficult dietary condition, it might make their experience there a little bit easier. So it does help, I guess, that I like to talk. And I've had full restaurants before, or full kitchen staff, all kind of standing around in the kitchen listening to me talk about PKU before. We had that experience recently down at this amazing little cafe on the way down to Anglesey, where everybody wanted to learn. They wanted to know. They'd never heard about this condition before. And I was just there speaking to the whole kitchen staff about Hudson's condition and what he can eat and what he can't. And people get curious and they look it up. And then you go back the next day and they're like, I Googled it, or I listened to this podcast. And it's a little part in the education process that I think helps and has made our life easier. As we've gone back to the same places where they now know us, and every time they have learned a little bit more and the meals they're giving Hudson are a little bit more fancy or a little bit more complicated or have a little bit more to it. So it's such a weird little thing to be proud of. But, I do get quite a kick out of seeing people embrace it and actually try to put together a meal which is a bit more nutritious than chips.
And then they could just listen to our podcast as well.
Exactly.
And I think we have got another question about breastfeeding, because it probably wasn't that long ago that he stopped breastfeeding.
No, it was about a year ago he stopped. So
Yep.
Hudson is now 3.5 and we stopped at about 2.5, September last year.
Okay, and what did you have, like a weaning process, or was it just naturally something that happened?
The reason we weaned was because we wanted to start looking into IVF for our second, and I hadn't quite got a set answer about whether or not you could breastfeed while doing IVF. You guys probably have a better understanding than I do, but in my head I kind of decided that if I was going to be putting my body through that process, I wanted to have weaned Hudson before I did that. And I was lucky. Hudson used to love to feed to sleep, and I quite liked that. My husband didn't love it as much. He was very supportive of it, but he wanted to be able to put Hudson to sleep himself. And so my husband had been making a real concentrated effort to do bedtimes and to get Hudson to sleep without him always falling to sleep on my boob. And so that was the first step, I guess, is Mike being able to put Hudson to bed and doing bedtimes every night, which was something he loves doing. And I was basically just feeding Hudson nap times. As they get older, the naps are less. So the weaning process kind of just happened organically. In saying that, I think Hudson would have just continued to breastfeed for as long as he could if I hadn't tried to make a conscious effort of putting him to sleep.
Well, it was nice that you could do it that way after that start that you had,
I think I held on to it because of it. I think people who might have told me that he should be able to go and have a nap without it, or, encourage me on ways I could put him down without breastfeeding. I wasn't in any rush to do that because we had such a difficult journey. And if he wanted to comfort feed, I was more than happy to do it. And it was giving me that feeling of we had made it. Breastfeeding was something I wanted to do, and we had all of the challenges, but I don't know how much he was getting by the end. It could have been nothing. As long as his protein levels were coming back every week in the safe range, we knew that he was tolerating his food allowance and the added breast milk he was getting. So I could finally take that pressure off, and it was relaxing finally towards the end. It wasn't stressful. It wasn't the 5-day wait for blood tests. His levels were kind of consistently coming back good, and I didn't have that guilt that breastfeeding was impacting him in a negative way. So, it was really nice. I think that last year was when I really kind of went, okay, we've succeeded at this. I feel proud that we got here. And I don't remember the weaning journey being incredibly difficult. Like I said, it was happening in any case. So by the time that IVF start date was creeping up, it just, I guess, created a drop dead date as to when we really did have to. And if he asked for it, overnight, actually just had to say no by that stage because it was something I wasn't comfortable with.
Okay, so I didn't check this with you beforehand, but did you want to talk about your IVF kind of as it relates to PKU?
Yeah, very happy to. So PKU is a genetic condition, which means my husband and I carry the recessive genes. So if we've each got a set of good genes and a set of recessive genes, and you pass on one set of genes from myself and one set of genes from my husband, there's a 25% chance that you both pass on your bad genes. So my husband and I being carriers means that we don't have PKU because even though we've got the bad gene, we've got a good gene. So when it comes to the genetics of having another baby, you've got a 25% chance of having another child with PKU. You've got a 50% chance of having a child who, like you, is a carrier, or a 25% chance again of having a child which, has both your healthy genes and is not even a carrier of PKU. So from the moment that we had Hudson, I think I was already thinking about IVF. I wanted to kind of start the process pretty early. I think it was a way of me processing my grief in a way. Probably around the 6-month mark with Hudson, we started looking into what IVF would look like. And we started looking into getting genetic carrier screening to make sure that there was nothing else going on. And we saw an IVF specialist to discuss it. So there would have been, a good chance that we would have been able to have a natural pregnancy and have a second child without PKU. It's a 75% chance. I didn't feel like I would be able to do that and enjoy the process. I think I felt like I would have been quite anxious. You know, everyone has their own journeys with this. And I have other friends who have had kids without, you know, second kids who don't have PKU. I knew it probably wasn't the process for me, knowing how much I'd struggled coming to terms with Hudson's diagnosis. And in any case, when we did all our testing, they came up with another issue. So not a genetic issue, but a chromosome issue I have, which is called a translocation, which makes me 60% more likely basically to miscarriage. The severity of my translocation means that if an embryo had, again, I'm completely fine with myself, but if I passed on the wrong amount of chromosomes to a baby, which was, you know, half my chromosomes, half my husband's, the embryo just wouldn't survive. So I think knowing that there was such a high percentage of me to miscarriage and a percentage risk of having a child with PKU, having a second issue just went, okay, let's give IVF a shot and save us a little bit of the unknown and the stress associated with that, and also the difficult journey of potentially going through miscarriages. So it's funny to think back to how I felt so grateful that we fell pregnant with Hudson naturally so quickly. When you've kind of had that journey to begin with, it was a real shock to then feel like we had to go through this slightly more complicated process if we want to grow our family. We've done 1 and 2 egg collections, and I remember the first egg collection we drove to, my husband and I just looking at each other in the car being like, how did we get here? Like it just felt a bit surreal that we were having to go through this whole journey for a second. But we did that last year out of quite a good amount of eggs we got because of these genetic complications. 2 cycles, we only got 1 embryo, which wasn't affected by either of these 2 issues. So we have 1 little embryo sitting there without this chromosome issue and without PKU. And when we're ready to continue growing our family, we'll see how that goes or if we have to do some more cycles. But I think I was shocked by the result of that first cycle as someone who was going into it thinking that because we didn't have fertility issues per se, we would have a good chance of getting, you know, quite a few embryos. I guess I kind of thought that by the time we got to freezing and genetically testing the embryos, the ones which were there must be strong enough that they wouldn't have these conditions. So then waiting the 2 weeks and getting those genetic results back and finding out that, you know, from 5 embryos we had, you know, 4 of them had my chromosome issue, 1 of them had PKU, and we got 1 out of those 5 which didn't have either. Yeah, it was a real shock. Wasn't what I was expecting.
No.
But yeah, so hopefully we'll be able to continue our journey next year and we'll see where that takes us.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing.
So I guess being 3.5, he's starting to get that language and understanding and all those sorts of things. So I guess what do you think he understands about his condition?
Yeah. So Hudson's never gone to childcare. So I do worry a little as to how we'll go for kinder next year when he actually is exposed to other kids eating. But in terms of our family environment at home, you know, he knows the word PKU. I don't know whether he knows what it means, but he, you know, I remember the first time he kind of spelt PKU with blocks, you know, with alphabet. He knows he has PKU. He knows of PKU. He knows that we have to weigh his food. He will put most of his foods on the scales. He'll put toys on the scales. Like he likes to weigh things because that's obviously something we've always done. So he has that knowledge. He is becoming more and more aware, I think, of mum and dad eating different meals.
Does he try and grab what you have?
No, he looks at it curiously. So he hasn't got to that stage yet. And I always find that interesting. He's never been, he's obviously, you know, we've been to parties where he has tried to grab food and we've said, you know, you can't have that and no, but he's never been that kid who would really grab food off our plate. And I don't know whether it's just because we've never given him that opportunity. So it is interesting when he's more aware now and you see him, just that little face he pulls when he's looking, he's like, is that something I want to eat? Like, what are you eating? Is that, especially because he's now, just from this Easter, he had his first chocolate. So, you know, when he sees things which look like they're in a wrapper, he instantly thinks that it's chocolate. So yeah, it is kind of interesting. And my husband does it very well at the end of the day. You know, if he asks for something and his protein levels for the day are too high and he can't have the crumpet he wants or the banana he wants because he doesn't have enough allowance left in the day. You know, we're very good at explaining that you can't have that today. We can put that on the menu for tomorrow, you know, and not being able to give him something he wants can be quite difficult. But yeah, I don't think he knows what PKU is. I don't think he quite realises that not everybody has it, that it's quite rare. But, you know, he's got an understanding of the fact that, you know, we do things differently for his food and he has to weigh his food and that's what keeps him healthy. And I guess we'll just have to keep communicating that with him, especially in the lead up to kinder next year.
Yeah. And what are your hopes for him as he's getting older and in primary school and in high school and all those sorts of things?
I've had this discussion with other PKU mums before where you really just want them to be confident and resilient with it. You know, I think I just want to know that of course it's going to be difficult. Of course it's going to be hard times. In saying that, research and science around treatments for PKU, which has been pretty much non-existent up until maybe this last year, and there's suddenly a bit more hope around some new treatments. You know, there is that kind of feeling that things will get easier as he gets older. And obviously we're at a different stage now. I can't imagine how hard it would have been to raise a child with PKU 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, I feel there's more awareness out there.
Yeah,
so
for diet things in general too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I do feel like it's easier, but I want him to just be confident in knowing what is right for him and his body and what makes him healthy, and to, I guess, be confident enough to not feel the need to give in to peer pressure or to not get upset by things. And you do hear all these beautiful stories about kids with conditions like this whose parents go to all this effort to make them food for parties, for school camps, and the kids are so proud and they actually love the fact that they've got different food as opposed to the other kids, and they don't want to be eating the canned food and the other kids want to be eating it. So it's a lot of effort which goes on behind the scenes to then make sure that our kids are having a normal diet which they're comfortable with and they're happy with. But if we can grow them up to be as resilient as possible with it, then we'll have done our job.
Fantastic. So if you think back to that kind of 5-day-old phone call that you got and you imagine another family in that situation, which, you know, I know that it's a very small community, but it is a community of people that you, I'm sure, have gotten to know fairly well. What advice would you have for someone who is in that situation that you were when Hudson was 5 days old?
I think it would be to, when they're ready, just reach out and get support and not feel like they have to do it alone. I feel like took us a while to reach out to our PKU community. I feel like it took us longer than I would have liked to get our family on board. I think having to tell family and friends that we'd had something come up was a really difficult process. That, you know, our son had been diagnosed with a genetic condition, one no one had ever heard about, one which people didn't quite understand the severity of. I found that whole process quite difficult. So to be able to find your community and get that support and know that you're not alone and know that we have these beautiful kids who are running around and jumping and active and learning, and who, you know, Hudson is so intelligent, he's reading, you know, who are excelling. And then there are teenagers who are doing really well at school, and there are adults who, you know, have their PhDs, and finding that community and taking that breath and being like, it will be okay, rather than doing what I probably did, which was lots of spirals at like 5 o'clock in the morning when my husband used to go to work. Any PKU mum that I meet who's kind of new to our community, you're an instant friend for life. You know, you're connected by something which other people just don't really understand. So yeah, definitely say find my mobile number and reach out, because we will be best friends. But yeah, to find your community. And the family and friends piece, I think, can be difficult. You know, I still feel like I have days where the mental load of what we go through with Hudson, I feel like as much as our family loves us and supports us, not everyone really understands that. So yeah, finding the people who do understand to kind of help you through when you are having times where you're like, this is hard, this is really difficult. You know, we've had messages as part of our little PKU mums group where it's like, I went out for brunch and all my kids were there feeding their kids and I couldn't just, pick something off the menu, and that was really hard. And being able to have that moment with other people who understand and who can, acknowledge that hard, not to wait so long to reach out and find those people.
And Erin, same question. What advice would you have for parents in that situation where they're about to go in for their first appointment with you after something has come up on the screening?
We want them to know that their child is not limited in their potential, because I think that's the thing that parents grieve the most, is that this is not the life that I envision for myself. And so we want them to know that their child can do all the things that, their other children or their cousins or whoever may be able to do, and they will still go to school and they will still grow up and they will still play sports and get jobs, and so that their potential is not limited because of this diagnosis. And also that breastfeeding in particular can be very emotional for some mothers, especially if it's something that they were really determined to do, to kind of let them know that all of those things that they plan to do are still possible, but they just might look a little bit different. And
what about just the general public, I guess, about PKU? I guess we're discovering that not very many people know about it. So I guess, that's a difficult one because they don't know what it is, and they might just go, just give him less meat. That's okay,
Yeah, you get a lot of the comments of, if he can eat fruit and veg, he's got a healthier diet than, what I have or what my kids have. And you have to kind of remind them he's still a toddler. Just because he has to eat fruit and veg doesn't mean he always wants to eat fruit or veg. So I think it's that empathy and compassion point, right? Like, you might not understand it. And so there's that need for everybody to put a positive spin on things. But just be curious. That's what makes the biggest impact, is when I have people who don't just try and dismiss it or put a silver lining to it, but who want to learn about it. That makes the biggest difference for anyone going through this journey. And I think at the end of the day, we are lucky enough to have so many people in our community who ask and try and include Hudson. And once you kind of get to that stage, if you have somebody you do know whose kids, have PKU or a similar condition, not always leaving it to the mum and dad to do everything. Obviously, that's our role. That's what we're there for. We're there to look after Hudson. But man, it makes such a difference when you have your sister-in-law who brings over a cake which is PKU friendly, or a friend who at least, has contacted you before a party to make sure there's one thing on the menu that Hudson can eat. We're always going to have that role as a parent of making sure that Hudson has food which is safe for him. But the mental load of constant cooking and calculations and, it's such a load to have to worry about everything your child puts in their mouth. Like, it's food. It's never ending, Food is something we have to do every day. So to be able to offer that type of support through just thinking ahead rather than just being like, they've got it in control. If you ever come across any other little kids who have this condition, then look up that we've got my Instagram account. There's so many Instagram accounts, you plug in PKU and you'll find people with recipes and things to share. So do that initiative and you'll make somebody's entire week if you can do something like that for them.
So that kind of comes to the end of the questions that we had. Is there anything that you'd like to add, kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, one thing we haven't talked about, I guess, obviously all the support that I got from Simone and all those visits. I think I did touch on just how much confidence you gave me in continuing our breastfeeding journey, but also for the rest of the ABA volunteers out there. As you can tell, I am an oversharer, and the amount of times I called the hotline for advice on the breast refusal or something breast related, and they gave the whole story of why we were formula feeding and why we were doing it in this odd way, and kind of the journey we've been on, and the compassion and the understanding I got from whichever volunteers were on the other side of the phone. So if you're listening to this and that was you, a big thank you, but it makes such a difference. I think our breastfeeding journey as new mums can sometimes be so overwhelming, and I think, I know for me it was something which was so important to me. So to have that support from you, Simone, and from the whole ABA community, I'll be forever grateful. So thank you.
Oh, that's amazing. What a beautiful
Try not
note
to cry.
to finish on. I feel like I can see that you've gotten emotional because it's so important too. But Simone and I are just here like waving our eyes, just going, oh, that's so wholesome. And we love hearing that as well. Like I know that Simone has touched a lot of people's lives as a lactation consultant, but also as volunteers for ABA. Sometimes we don't hear that kind of feedback. So it's really nice to hear you say that and to know that, you know, maybe one of those times when we're on helpline, we've actually touched someone else's life. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So Yolanda, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us about your story.
Thank you. Happy listening.
For more information and links, please check the episode notes. For breastfeeding information or to access live chat with a qualified volunteer, visit breastfeeding.asn.au. You can speak to a breastfeeding counsellor on the National Breastfeeding Helpline on 1800 Mum to Mum or 1800 686 268. The Australian Breastfeeding Association receives funding from the Australian Government. Please rate, review and subscribe to Breastfeeding with ABA. Thank you for supporting the Australian Breastfeeding Association.